channel. We're going to do something a little bit different today. And the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this microphone because it's not working right now. And I do apologize for the poor quality of the audio, but we're doing what we can do. I am actually down for the count for the next couple of days in working on my automobiles due to an old aggravation of my elbow. What I wanted to talk about today was the other side of this channel, something I haven't covered a whole lot. I've had one or two videos in the past on it. That's the bass guitar. As I've noted in previous videos, I've been playing bass for many years, played professionally for many years as well. What I wanted to talk about, and I was actually inspired by another YouTuber who had a discussion on his top favorite bands of certain genres and things of that nature. What I'm going to discuss is the 10 albums, the top 10 albums that really shaped me as a musician. And I'm not going to go through from my least favorite to my favorite. That's not how I'm going to approach this. The way I'm going to approach this is it's going to deal with the earliest influence all the way up to the most recent as far as influences on my playing. I'm going to go over the actual track listings on them and talk about songs on those particular albums that really excuse me, had the biggest impact on my playing as a musician. I think it's a fairly eclectic list. You're going to see some prog stuff, some jazz stuff, honestly some pop punk and some emo stuff as well. That's later in my career. Let's just go through the list right now and kind of give you an idea of what I think were the most influential albums and influential bands that impacted me most as a musician. And of course I would welcome it if you liked and subscribed to the video, but most important, talk in the comments about albums and music and even bands that impacted you. It doesn't even have to be from a musical sense, just music that impacted you personally. The first album I'm going to talk about, and I am a Gen Xer, so I'm a little bit old, so you're going to basically be seeing that some of these are rather dated as far as way back there, is the 1975 album from the band Kansas called Mask. Now this was their third studio album. It's the one that immediately preceded Left Overture, which is the one that has Carry On Wayward Son on it, and of course the album after that, Point of No Return, that had Dust in the Wind on it. Those are the two songs that most people know from this band. But I was a Kansas fan early on thanks to the influence of my brother Robert, and this particular album struck me very much. It's a little bit unusual. The bass player is Dave Hope, who is a phenomenal bass player, and he is the antithesis of the way I play. He plays with a pick. I do know how to play with a pick, and I use it under certain circumstances, but it's not how I approach the instrument. But the main thing that this album impacted me on was early on in my life I enjoyed fairly complex music. I didn't really go for the 1-4-5 blues progressions, the standard rock pentatonic stuff and things of that nature. I enjoyed odd time signatures. I enjoyed counterpart and melody, and just the more complicated the better was my approach early on when I first developed an interest in music. Now I'm looking here at the track list on this particular album. This album is kind of a mix and match of stuff. It's my personal favorite album by the band also. But the songs that really hit me the most are Icarus One or Wings of Steel. I saw them play that live back in the late 70s. Just a great song. But the two end tracks, Mysteries of Mayhem and The Pinnacle, both of those songs really score not only the musicianship of the entire band and the abilities that they have personally, but also they tell a really cool story. I'll try to include a link in the comments to a YouTube video that has them playing The Pinnacle live from the Don Kirshner Rock Concert show back in the mid-70s. If you haven't had a chance to see that, definitely check it out. It's worth the view for sure. The second album that really impacted me greatly, I wouldn't be a bass player if I didn't say Geddy Lee had a tremendous effect on my learning how to play the instrument, my enthusiasm for the instrument, and learning how to think outside the box and not just play root or root 5 the way it is in country and standard blues and rock and roll. The album Permanent Waves, which is their 1980 album, is my personal favorite. It's the one that immediately preceded Moving Pictures. Now, obviously, without this album, there would have been no Moving Pictures, because the album preceding this one was another favorite personal of mine, which is Hemispheres, their most progressive album by far. And this album really represented a very dramatic change in their approach to music. But Geddy Lee is where it began for me as far as a bass guitarist. Now, I noted earlier Dave Hope's influence on my playing. Of course, that is absolutely the truth. But the fact of the matter remains is Geddy is the reason I picked up the instrument. His tone on the Rickenbacker bass that he was playing, his multitasking astonished me, playing keyboards with both his hands and feet, playing bass, singing at the same time. Just a monster musician, in my opinion. This was an album that had 6 tracks on it, and by far my personal favorite on this one is the last track on side 1 of the album. Yes, we're still dealing with albums back then. You had a side 1 and side 2, not like CDs or uploads, of course. But Jacob's Ladder, specifically the live version that came off of the Exit Stage Left album, was my first notice of this particular song. But that's a favorite of mine, and the last song on the album itself, Natural Science, is just a masterclass on musicianship. All 3 of them are playing absolutely to the wall. Very, very inspiring for me. First time I heard this album was in 1982, 81, somewhere in there. It was right after I heard Moving Pictures, as a matter of fact. Of course, everybody was listening to Tom Sawyer and Limelight and all the great songs off of that one. That got me enthused with the band. This is the next album I bought, and the song Natural Science just absolutely blew me away and took me to the next level as far as my understanding of music and just my enthusiasm for playing bass. Album number 3, for me personally, we're getting into the mid-80s now. I graduated high school rather in the mid-80s. Took a couple of years off doing any number of things. I was a DJ at a local country music station. I was also doing news commentating for the Arkansas Radio Network back in those days. And then I started college in 1987. I like to refer to this as I was heavily into my jazz phase at this point. And the album by Chick Corea Electric Band, Eye of the Beholder, which is their 3rd album, really, really just blew me away as well. John Patitucci is the bass player on this one. Of course, you've got the Monster and Dave Weckl on the drums, Frank Gambale playing guitar, Eric Marienthal on sax, and of course Chick Corea, who is my personal favorite keyboard player as well. This whole album is just wonderful. It's all instrumental stuff, of course. You would expect nothing else from a fusion album. But if you enjoy just wonderful music, wonderful compositions, and just monster playing, I definitely recommend you check this one out. John Patitucci was my first introduction to extended range bass guitars. He, back in these days, was one of the first players, that, at least that I took note of, that was playing a Ken Smith 6-string bass, which has a low B and a high C, of course. The solo that he does on the 8th track on this one, Trance Dance, was my personal favorite back in the day. But all of the songs on this album are wonderful, and I definitely recommend you listen to the extended cut. Back in the day, the first purchase of this album was a cassette. Yes, we're talking about many years ago. And there's actually a couple of tracks at the tail end of it that weren't on the cassette. They were on the CD release, but not the cassette. Izenda, track 10, and Amnesia, track 11. Izenda is a fantastic song, and when I first heard the CD and heard that song after listening to the cassette for over a year, I was kind of angry that the cassette didn't have that one, because it quickly became a favorite of mine. Album number 4, we're talking about the mid-80s again. The last album I talked about and the next couple that I'm talking about are all mid-80s stuff. But I am the world's biggest fan, I like to say I am anyway, the world's biggest fan of the Police, Regatta de Blanc, their second album from 1979, is my personal favorite. I got into them a little bit late. I was a little bit dismissive of them because when I first took notice of them was when the Synchronicity album came out. And of course, me being the moody and angst-ridden teenager, I didn't like anything that was popular at that time, so I kind of ignored the Police early on. But after a while, I got hooked on it, and this second album, Regatta de Blanc, is my personal favorite. I really enjoy Sting as a vocalist, a writer, and a bass guitarist, but to be honest with you, what did it for me on the Police in general, and this album in particular, is Stuart Copeland. Stuart Copeland is one of my favorite drummers. All bass players have a favorite drummer. Of course, Neil Peart is a favorite drummer, but Stuart Copeland just really plays in a way that I really enjoy, with a traditional grip, the pseudo reggae influences as well as early punk influences as well. I always consider them as punk with a music IQ, because they kind of had that punk vibe on their first couple of albums, but at the same time the songs were much more complex than the 2 and 3 chord stuff that you heard from punk bands at the time. So I really enjoy this album very much, and looking at the track listing on it, of course it's got Message in a Bottle on it, Walking on the Moon. Those were the big hits off of it. The ones that really got me though were Regatta de Blanc, the title track, The Bed's Too Big Without You. Fantastic bass line on that one. It's a simple bass line, but it's wonderful to listen to, very well constructed, and of course Does Everyone Stare. Those are the ones that really got played over and over again by me early on in my life. So that album, probably the fourth one that I would note on this list as far as chronologically that had a big impact on me. The next one is going to take us in a totally different direction. There was a music store in downtown Little Rock, Arkansas, right across from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, called Discount Records. It was a two-store chain, if you will. Discount Records was in Little Rock, Peaches Records was in North Little Rock, but that's where you went to buy albums, and you also bought CDs when they first came out, cassette tapes. They even had 8 tracks back in the day. And other various paraphernalia that we won't go into. Yes, it was a head shop. But anyway, that's not why I was there. I went in there one day looking for an album. This is when I was first starting to really get enthused with bass guitar. This was about 1987. This album came out in 84, but this was about 1987. I started picking up the bass when I was 16, but I really didn't get serious with it until after I was out of high school. And the album is the David Sanborn album, Straight to the Heart. Really kind of smooth jazz, a little bit poppy as far as from the jazz standpoints go, and I don't know how jazz purists feel about this album, or David Sanborn in particular, but I really enjoyed it. But the main thing about this album is it was my first exposure to Marcus Miller, the tone guy. The story goes with my exposure to this album as I walk in. Of course, they always had music playing in the background while you're shopping in there for records and tapes and things of that nature. But the third track on it, Run for Cover, came on over the loudspeakers in the store. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that song opens up with a bass solo. It was my first real exposure to slap bass guitar. It was my first exposure to soloing the bass guitar as an instrument. And it really was an eye-opening experience. I really dug it. I immediately whipped out the wallet and purchased this album, and for the next 6 months listened to it over and over again. This album has some monster musicians on it. It has David Sanborn, of course, Marcus Miller, as I noted. Hiram Bullock actually plays on this. Buddy Williams plays drums on some of the tracks. Michael White, Michael Brecker, the tenor saxophonist, is on there. I actually saw Chick Corea at Mud Island in '89, and the opening act was a new version of Herbie Hancock's The Headhunters, and Michael Brecker was one of the players in that band. That was really a thrilling thing too. But this album really started taking me in different directions, because up until now it was primarily prog and some pop stuff, but not really prog, and some mixtures. This kind of opened my eyes and made me enter my jazz phase fully. The Chick Corea stuff started that out actually in '85 when the drummer in the band I was playing in at that time introduced me to their first album. That got me listening to it. But this album is what really got me interested in different techniques on the bass, because until that time I was primarily a fingerstyle player doing the Getty thing and things of that nature. This was my first exposure to slap. This is my first exposure to a really thick, heavy tone, and started making me look at different things in the realm of bass guitar that really opened my eyes. The next album on my list is probably the single most influential album in my personal life as a musician. It is by my favorite band of all time, one of my favorite bass players of all time, and has my favorite drummer of all time, and what I personally believe is the greatest vocalist ever in the history of rock and roll. The band is Living Colour. The album is their second album from 1990 called Time's Up. Their first album, Vivid, is the one that everybody knows. That's the one with Cult of Personality on it, Open Letter to a Landlord, Glamour Boys, all those hits that got them going on MTV. This was their follow-up album, and it just really exploded my mind on different textures, different approaches to songwriting, and really started getting me thinking outside the box. With the prog stuff and the jazz stuff I was listening to previously, I was really into the technical side of things. Time signatures, different modes, different key signatures, changing tempos in the song and adding layers and complexities to it, but all staying technically within the realms of theory. Muzz Skillings is the bass player on this album, and there's just a lot of playing on this that I found very inspiring and honestly very off the cuff, outside of the box, and very strange. Some of the tracks on this album, and again, this is really my favorite band of all time, and in my opinion, the best album from my favorite band of all time, but the songs on it that really struck me, the first one I took notice of was a song called Under Cover of Darkness. This has a very young and at the time unknown Queen Latifah as a guest vocalist on it. But the bass line, I grinded on this song for months trying to figure out the bass line on this. You can imagine me in my room with the lights off, annoying the hell out of my roommates, trying to figure this song off. Ology, the track after that, is a bass-only song with a drum loop going on that is just phenomenal. The last track, This Is the Life, has one of my favorite vocal performances of all time on it. This album is just so rich with so many great things. It was really life-altering for me. I don't want to sound melodramatic, but this album really was life-altering for me because it really got me going in a direction that I had never been in before. This got me going into heading into listening to heavier stuff, into a lot funkier stuff. This really threw me into the area of starting to pick up and learn about R&B artists, the bass players in R&B like James Jamerson, Larry Graham, of course, who's the king of slap. Of course, later on, Victor Wooten, people like that. But this really got me into a new realm of music that I hadn't listened to. What I like to tell people is when I'm talking about this album is I had pretty much a straight line from prog to jazz, and then this album hit me, and my playing just took a hard left. I mean, it changed my entire approach to the instrument and was really a pinnacle of enjoyment for me from a musician standpoint. Well, I've raved about that one long enough. The next album I'm going to get into is, honestly, from what I've seen on YouTube videos, is a little bit of a controversial pick because a lot of people love him, but a lot of newer people, it seems to be popular to hate on this band. But it's the Red Hot Chili Peppers, their album from 1991, Blood Sugar Sex Magik. Flea, of course, Michael Balzari, is the bass player on this album. This, in my personal view, is their best album, and it's also the last really great album they did. The albums after that, of course, were far more popular as far as album sales and getting them in the mainstream. But this album, just the playing from start to finish, the bass tones from start to finish, it's really funky, really cool, really enjoyable. Explicit lyrics, of course, as all early Chili Pepper stuff had, but this album really did it to me. The first track right off the bat, Power of Equality, is just a banger from the get-go. If You Have to Ask, the chorus breakdown on that is just one of the funkiest passages I've ever heard in my life, and it's just really, really great. This is the album that has Give It Away on. It also has Under the Bridge. It was their first really huge hit album. They had had some minor hits previous to this, but this was their first really huge hit album, of course. But this entire album from front to back, I probably wore out 3 copies of this CD, listening to it back in 1990. This put me further on down the funk and hard rock path that the Living Colour album that I previously mentioned took me on and got me started on. This took me further down that path. And of course, around the time of Time's Up, the previous album, and this album, I was really starting to really gig heavily at this time. The early 90s is when I really started playing a lot. Of course, I played in hotels and a few gigs here and there from about 1987 until this time, but about 1990, 1991, I started playing a lot. And of course, I like to tell people that practice is where you learn how to play the instrument, but honestly, gigging is where you get good, because that's where you start to experiment. And I've always had a fairly reckless approach to my live performances. I like to go for it when I'm listening to it. I like to envelop myself in the music. A lot of times that leads to mistakes, but the way I look at it is, in a live setting, if you make a mistake, keep going. Chances are you're going to be the only one that noticed it, because let's face it, in nightclubs, a lot of times the people that are listening are just having a party and having fun, and the people that, the rest of the people aren't even listening to you. So it's really great to experiment, and this album really got me going down that path of funk and rock and roll. The next album on my list is one I attribute to a gentleman who is an old friend of mine, lives south of Nashville, Tennessee. His name is Brian. He has a channel called Daily Brew Garage. I think it's what's called Daily Brew Garage. And Brian really is, he's a drummer, very talented drummer, phenomenal drummer, one of the guys that I played with when I was growing up. And he got me turned on to these guys, and this was my first introduction to the more R&B side of funk. You're no longer dealing with slap bass, you're dealing with strictly fingerstyle. It's Francis Rocco Prestia and the album Tower of Power. Their self-titled album is their most successful album to date. It was released in 1973. This is the album that had What Is Hip on it, This Time Is Real, Soul Vaccination, their big monster hit, So Very Hard to Go. Interesting thing about the song So Very Hard to Go, a band I was in the late 90s, early 2000s, played that song. It was a 3-piece with a vocalist, and to play Power as a 3-piece band, I think is an exercise in bravery, and probably an exercise in stupidity too, because you don't have the horns and everything else, but we covered the song, I think, adequately. The interesting thing about the story on that one is we were playing at Little Rock Riverfront Amphitheater, opening up for James Brown. And this is the song that we played that honestly got Mr. Brown looking at us. He stood stage left, my side of the stage, the entire time we played, which was intimidating to say the least. But we played this song, and he kind of stood up and started listening to us, and was very, very nice and complimentary after the set. And he hung a nickname on me after that show that stuck for many, many years. I tell the story that the nickname is Graham Cracker. The guys in the band used to call me that for a while afterwards, and a lot of other people did. The way it came about is he told me that I didn't play that bass like any white boy he'd ever heard. If I'm a cracker, I'm probably a Graham Cracker, and it stuck. But that was a very humbling and wonderful experience dealing with James Brown, and it all circles back around playing a Rocco Prestia piece in So Very Hard to Go and the Pizzicato Funk that he did. That album right there really hit me hard, and I like to thank Brian for turning me on to this group and got me listening to them, and of course they're one of my all-time favorites now. The 9th album on my list is getting to the grunge era a little bit more. It's my favorite band of the grunge era. It's Stone Temple Pilots. It's their second album, Purple, which was released, I believe, in 1994. I like this album a little bit more than their introductory album, Core. This Robert DeLeo is, in my personal opinion, one of the most underrated bass guitarists out there. The guy has melody chops for days. He writes a lot of the stuff. In fact, he writes most of the stuff for them, and his bass lines are just very, very melodic, very filling, not boring at all, very modal approach, and has a mix match of a lot of different styles. And this album was one of my favorites. It has Vaseline on it and Interstate Love Song, which are the ones that are probably the most popular. Big Empty is a big song that I really, really enjoy. And Kitchenware and Candy Bars, which was the hidden track, was particularly enjoyable for me too. But that album right there was my favorite out of the grunge era. And to this day, I picked that one out and spent it quite a bit as well. The last album on my list, again, is one of those hard left turns. This is a band that my daughter turned me on to. I didn't start listening to this group until 2010, 2011. I was to the point where I was getting kind of bored with modern music. The modern music out there is great. I'm not one of those old fuddy-duddies that thinks my music is better than everybody else's music and your music sucks, etc., etc. That's not who I am. But I would be lying and remiss if I didn't say that the music being released after about 1999 had kind of lost my interest a little bit. Of course, I was still listening to the groups that I had listened to previously that were still putting albums out. But as far as new acts, I just wasn't really interested in everything, and that's to my detriment. My daughter one day gets in the car after high school. This would have been in about 2009, 2010, and sticks this CD in, and I just fell in love with it. And it's Three Cheers for Sweet Revenge by My Chemical Romance. This kind of started me down the emo and pop punk phase that I really, really enjoy. The playing is not particularly difficult compared to the other stuff that I listen to. Of course, everything up until now is very challenging to play on the bass, and this is really just a root simple type of album. There's nothing remarkable about the playing other than the fact that what Mikey Way plays is perfect for the songs, and I just really, really enjoy the music and the songs on this. It has great energy, very, very I love listening to this album. I don't necessarily think that it is stuff that I've played live because frankly at this point in my life I'm too old to be jumping into mosh pits like I did in the early 90s. But this album really sparked my interest because it was kids younger than me still playing rock and roll and doing it well. I really, really enjoy this album. If you haven't, of course, the album after this one, The Black Parade, was probably their biggest album, but this is the one that I really like as far as from their catalog goes. I like all of the albums from their catalog very, very much, and I own all of them, but this album is probably my favorite. Of course, Helena, the first song on it, is a great banger. To the End is a good one. The Ghost of You was my daughter's favorite song for a long time, but my personal favorite on this one is Thank You for the Venom. Just song after song on this. It's very, very high tempo, very, very hard rocking stuff, very high energy, and just a lot of fun to listen to. And it really got me into a mode of calming my playing down a little bit after years of playing complex lines and playing R&B and circling on groove and everything else, and this kind of got me more interested in simpler stuff, not simple stuff, but simpler stuff. And also for many years in my playing I kind of turned my nose up at pick players because I didn't enjoy the tone of a pick, but this album got me to pick up the plectrum and start working and playing a pick with a pick as well as my fingers and my thumb. And I've since changed my attitude completely about that and determined that the pick, like everything else, is a tool. And as a musician, I think you ought to have a full toolbox and fill it full of every tool that you can find to make you the most versatile player you can be. So this really, the way this album rather, impacted me is it got me picking up a technique that I had previously shunned, and I actually really enjoy playing that way now. Well, that's my list. I hope you enjoyed this. I really look forward to your comments on this particularly because I'd like to hear what songs, what albums, what bands impacted you the most. That's something I'd like to hear from you. Of course, I'd always welcome comments on this. And we're not going to talk about which music sucks, which music is better than this, because I've always viewed music as subjective. You will never hear me say that this band is better than that band. You will simply say that I prefer this band over that band. And that's the way I approach it. It's a subjective thing. If you're a Beyonce fan, that's wonderful. If you're a Taylor Swift fan, that's wonderful. If you're a Limp Bizkit fan, that's wonderful. If you're a Rush fan, that's wonderful. All music is great to somebody out there, and I never think you should belittle somebody for their music taste, so we're not going to go down that road. But I would love to hear the music that really impacted you the most. And I would like to hear from all ages as well, not just people my age. I would like to hear from all generations, because that lets me learn about other players, and not only that, it's an opportunity for me as a musician to hear what somebody else really listens to, and allows me to pick it up and listen to it as well. It might be something that I've never been exposed to that I would like to listen to. So I welcome your comments. Thank you for indulging me on this video. We'll get back to the car stuff another time. Until then, stay safe out there. I appreciate your time.